In October of 1897, a black girl named Lydia Johnson stood before 5 white men inside a locked lecture hall in Philadelphia and answered a question that no living scientist could explain. The question involved numbers, memory, and prediction. She was 14 years old. She had never attended a formal school. She answered in under 12 seconds. By the end of that month, 3 professors resigned. 1 medical journal issue was seized. 2 men publicly denounced her as a fraud. And Lydia Johnson vanished from public record. The white scientific community called it hysteria. The newspapers called it a curiosity. The black community whispered something else entirely. What they did not know was that Lydia had already predicted all of it. By 1901, every man who had tried to prove her impossible brilliance would be ruined, socially, professionally, or worse. What exactly did Lydia Johnson know? How did she know it? And why did powerful men decide that the truth about her could never be allowed to survive? Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind Lydia Johnson, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. In the autumn of 1897, Philadelphia breathed smoke. Coal fires burned day and night, thickening the air until it settled into the lungs like damp wool. Factory whistles cried before dawn. Horse carts rattled over stone streets slick with yesterday's rain and yesterday's waste. Gas lamps flickered even at midday, not because the sun had vanished, but because soot dulled everything it touched. The city was rich, ambitious, and cruel in quiet ways. Philadelphia liked to call itself enlightened. It boasted universities, lecture halls, medical schools, and learned societies that claimed to measure truth itself. Men in pressed coats spoke of progress and civilization while entire neighborhoods of black families were pushed into narrow streets where sunlight barely reached the ground. Intelligence was cataloged. Worth was measured. Humanity was ranked. And in those rankings, black minds always came last. Scientific journals of the time stated it plainly, without embarrassment. The Negro brain, they said, was smaller, less complex, incapable of abstract reasoning beyond basic labor. It was not hatred, they insisted. It was science, numbers, calipers, charts drawn in clean ink by clean hands. Those men did not walk through 7th Ward. They did not smell boiling starch from open wash tubs, hear hymns rising from cracked church windows, or see children counting cobblestones because there were no books. They did not see the way survival itself demanded memory, calculation, and foresight sharper than anything taught in a classroom. On a narrow street just off Lombard, in a brick row house that leaned slightly to the left, Lydia Johnson lived with her mother. Ruth Johnson woke before the city every morning. She washed white people's clothes with water that burned her hands raw. She folded garments she would never wear. She listened more than she spoke. In church, she sat straight-backed and silent while others sang loud enough to prove they belonged. She believed in order, in restraint, in keeping one's head down. Her daughter made that difficult. Lydia was 14 in October of that year, though she looked younger when she stood still. Slim, dark-skinned, hair pulled back too tightly because Ruth believed neatness could shield a child from trouble. Lydia's eyes were the unsettling part. They did not wander. They did not flicker. They rested on things as if weighing them, measuring something beneath the surface. She rarely fidgeted, rarely laughed loudly. When she spoke, it was with certainty that made adults uncomfortable, not because she was defiant, but because she was precise. Ruth had noticed it early. At 6, Lydia repeated entire sermons word for word on the walk home, correcting the preacher's pauses when he missed them. At 8, she memorized grocery ledgers after one glance and could tell a shopkeeper exactly how much coin was missing from the drawer. At 10, she began asking questions Ruth could not answer. Why do numbers always come out the same even when people lie? Ruth had stopped scrubbing and stared at her daughter's hands, small and steady in the basin. They just do, she said. Do not trouble yourself with it. Lydia nodded. She always nodded. But she never stopped thinking. She attended a segregated school when attendance was enforced and stayed home when it was not. The teacher did her best and failed quickly. Arithmetic lessons ended in minutes. Reading assignments were returned corrected in margins no one had taught Lydia to use. When reprimanded for insolence, Lydia only looked confused. I am not arguing, she said once. I am finishing. That sentence would be remembered later. Misquoted. Stripped of its calm. The neighbors whispered. Some said the girl was touched by God. Others said she was touched by something else. One woman crossed herself when Lydia passed, murmuring that knowledge came at a price. Ruth heard all of it and said nothing. What Ruth did not know was that Lydia had already begun to notice patterns in people. She knew which men grew angry when corrected, Which women smiled while listening for weakness? Which children lied without realizing it? She learned that adults did not like being seen clearly. She learned to answer softly, to wait. By the time the letter arrived, Lydia had already imagined it. It came in a plain envelope, delivered by a white boy who would not meet Ruth's eyes. Inside was an invitation written in careful script, requesting that Lydia Johnson appear for an academic demonstration at a local hall, under supervision, for the advancement of knowledge. Ruth read it 3 times. "They want to test you," she said finally. "Like an exhibit." Lydia considered the paper, the ink, the spacing between words. "They want to be certain," she said. "Certain of what?" Lydia looked up, her gaze steady, unreadable. "That they are right." Outside, the city groaned and hissed and moved forward, convinced of its own understanding. Above them, in offices filled with charts and skull measurements, men prepared questions they believed no child like Lydia Johnson could ever answer. None of them knew that the answers had already been waiting. The demonstration was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, chosen deliberately. Tuesdays were quiet. No major lectures. No visiting dignitaries. If the girl failed, the embarrassment could be contained. If she succeeded, well, no one involved believed that likely. The hall stood 3 blocks from the university grounds, a narrow brick building that smelled of chalk dust and old varnish. Lydia noticed the smell immediately. She always did. Smells arrived before sights, before sounds, like warnings. Ruth held her daughter's hand as they entered, her grip firmer than necessary. The floorboards creaked under their weight. White men turned. Conversation softened, then stopped. Lydia counted them without effort. 7 seated. 3 standing near the wall. 1 by the window pretending to read. 11 total. She noted which ones had ink-stained fingers and which ones smelled faintly of tobacco and cologne. She noted who avoided looking at her and who stared too long. Dr. Harold Whitcomb stepped forward. He was tall, narrow, with a beard trimmed to suggest discipline. His eyes did not linger on Lydia's face. They moved instead to her skull, the set of her jaw, the breadth of her brow. "Miss Johnson," he said. No contraction. No warmth. "Thank you for agreeing to participate." "I did not agree," Ruth said quietly. "I received a letter." Whitcomb smiled as if he had not heard her. "This will be brief," he said. "We are merely curious." Curiosity was a word Lydia had learned to distrust. It often meant permission without consent. They seated her at a small desk in the center of the room. No papers. No slate. No pencil. That had been intentional. Whitcomb wanted no excuses. Professor Edwin Markham cleared his throat. He was younger than Whitcomb, red-faced, already irritated by the very idea of the afternoon. His reputation rested on mathematical proofs published in journals that rarely acknowledged black existence except as error. "We will begin simply," he said. "Mental arithmetic. No tricks." "There are no tricks," Lydia said. A few men shifted. Markham frowned. "Very well." He began with multiplication. Large numbers spoken aloud, deliberately fast. Lydia answered before he finished the last digit. He tried division, then fractions, then sequences designed to overwhelm memory rather than logic. She answered all of them. The chalk squeaked as a man by the board wrote down her responses, slower than her speech. Whitcomb watched closely, searching for tells, lip movement, finger tapping, signs of calculation. There were none. Markham's voice tightened. "Very impressive," he said, though the words tasted sour. "Now we will proceed to something more challenging." He recited a list of 37 numbers once. No repetition. He waited. Lydia folded her hands. 14 was incorrect, she said. It should have been 40. The room went still. "That is impossible," Markham said. "You said 40, Lydia replied. "But you thought 14. Several heads turned sharply. "What nonsense is this?" Whitcomb snapped. "You hesitated," Lydia said, her tone neutral. "Between 4 and 0. Markham flushed. "Repeat the sequence." Lydia did, backward without pause. One of the standing men laughed, a short, nervous sound, then stopped when no one joined him. Dr. Louise Carter, seated near the wall, had not spoken yet. She was the only woman present, her posture rigid, her notebook untouched. She watched Lydia not as an object, but as a problem that refused to remain contained. "Try this," Carter said suddenly. Whitcomb glanced at her, displeased, but nodded. Carter described a pattern. Numbers nested within numbers, intervals shifting unpredictably. It was the sort of problem that took trained minds minutes, sometimes hours. Lydia listened. Her eyes did not move. When Carter finished, Lydia answered, then added something else. In 6 iterations, she said, the pattern collapses. That is not part of the question, Whitcomb said sharply. It will be, Lydia replied. Silence stretched. Somewhere outside, a cart rattled past. Lydia felt the weight of their attention like pressure against her skin, not painful but insistent. What method did you use? Markham demanded. I recognized it, Lydia said. Recognized it from where? Whitcomb pressed. Lydia paused. It was the first time she had done so all afternoon. From before, she said. Ruth shifted in her seat. She did not like that answer. It sounded like trouble. Whitcomb exchanged a look with Markham. This was no longer a curiosity. This was a threat. Not because the girl was clever, but because she did not perform cleverness the way they understood. Blindfold her, Markham said abruptly. Ruth stood. Absolutely not. It is necessary, Whitcomb said, to rule out visual cues. There are none, Lydia said. They blindfolded her anyway. Questions continued. She answered them all. More quickly now. As if impatience had crept in. As if the exercise had already proven what it could. When the blindfold was removed, Lydia blinked once, then looked directly at Whitcomb. You will publish this incorrectly, she said. Whitcomb laughed. We have not discussed publication. You will, Lydia said. And you will remove Dr. Carter's question. Carter stiffened. That is absurd, Markham said. Lydia tilted her head slightly. You are afraid of it. Whitcomb ended the session immediately. Ruth and Lydia were escorted out without ceremony. No thanks. No explanation. Outside, the afternoon light felt sharper, colder. What did you do? Ruth asked as they walked home. I answered, Lydia said. Ruth said nothing. She had the uneasy sense that something irreversible had begun. Above them, in offices filled with notes and measurements, men argued in low voices. Papers were shuffled. Conclusions drafted before questions were finished. None of them understood yet that Lydia Johnson had not guessed a single answer, and none of them realized how dangerous that made her. By Thursday morning, the story had already changed shape. It did not travel through newspapers first. It moved faster than print, faster than ink could dry. It traveled through hallways, through closed doors left slightly ajar, through men who leaned too close and lowered their voices as if secrets were lighter when whispered. A Negro girl, they said. A clever trick, others insisted. A humiliation narrowly avoided. By noon, curiosity had hardened into something sharper. Whitcomb convened a second meeting without notifying Ruth Johnson. This one was smaller. Controlled. No audience. No mother present to object. The invitation was framed as routine continuation, the language carefully stripped of urgency. Lydia read it twice, then folded it and placed it beneath her pillow. They are unsettled, she said that evening. Ruth paused in her mending. Who? The men from the hall. Ruth did not ask how Lydia knew. She was learning which questions made her uneasy. The meeting took place in a classroom with tall windows and a single blackboard washed so clean it reflected light. 4 men were present this time. No women. Dr. Carter had been unavoidably detained. That absence mattered. Markham paced while Lydia sat. Whitcomb stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid, jaw tight. This is not a performance, Markham said. You will answer only what is asked. I always do, Lydia replied. Markham ignored her. He began with probability. Coin tosses. Dice. Hypothetical outcomes. Lydia answered, then corrected his assumptions. You are confusing likelihood with expectation, she said. Markham slammed his hand against the desk. You will not lecture me. Lydia looked at his hand, then back to his face. You already knew that, she said. Whitcomb intervened quickly. Miss Johnson, can you explain how you arrive at your answers? No. Why not? Because you would not believe it. That was when the room shifted. Until then, they had assumed cooperation could be extracted with patience or pressure, that the girl would eventually reveal a mechanism they could dismantle. But refusal, calm, unapologetic refusal, was something else entirely. Markham leaned closer. If you cannot explain it, then it is not knowledge. It is mimicry. Then test it until it fails, Lydia said. Whitcomb hesitated. He had already begun to suspect something uncomfortable. Not fraud. Something worse. They presented a problem copied from a German journal published 2 years earlier, untranslated, unpublished in English. Lydia had no access to such material. They knew that. That was the point. She listened. She answered. She paused, then frowned slightly. This was misprinted, she said. The third value should be negative. Markham stared. That is impossible. Whitcomb snatched the journal, flipped pages, fingers trembling. The correction was in the margin of the original German edition. Markham had overlooked it. No one spoke. Whitcomb closed the book slowly. This concludes today's session. As Lydia stood, she felt it for the first time, not curiosity, not interest, but fear. It sat behind Whitcomb's eyes, heavy and calculating. Outside, rain began without warning. Lydia held her coat tight as they walked home. She did not speak until they reached their street. They will not stop, she said. Ruth stopped walking. What do you mean? They will not stop asking, Lydia replied. And they will not accept the answers. That night, Ruth dreamed of hands pulling pages from a book, tearing them before she could read what was written. The following Sunday, a man Ruth had never seen before appeared after church. He was polite. Too polite. He asked questions that circled rather than landed. He asked about Lydia's schooling, her father, her habits. Ruth answered carefully. Lydia stood beside her, silent. You have a remarkable child, the man said finally. It would be a shame if people misunderstood her. That word again. Misunderstood. By Monday, the first article appeared, not in a major journal, but in a local circular known for academic gossip. It did not name Lydia directly. It referred instead to a colored subject of alleged aptitude and raised concerns about suggestion, rehearsal, and observer bias. Whitcomb's language was unmistakable. Carter read it in her office and felt her stomach turn. This is premature, she said aloud, though no one was there to hear her. She requested access to the notes from the second session. The request was denied. That evening, Markham visited Whitcomb's office. They spoke behind closed doors for over an hour. This cannot stand, Markham said. If she is accepted, everything collapses. Whitcomb poured himself a drink he did not offer. We do not need acceptance, he said. We need containment. By what means? Whitcomb looked at the wall, at the charts that had guided his career. By reminding the world who is allowed to be exceptional. Across the city, Lydia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Numbers drifted and rearranged themselves without effort. Outcomes layered over moments like transparent sheets. She saw the article before it was written. She saw the way Carter would hesitate, the way Ruth's hands would shake when the second letter arrived. Most of all, she saw the moment when the questions would stop being questions at all. It would be called an investigation. Years later, men would insist that was where everything went wrong. They would be lying. The second letter arrived sealed in heavier paper, the kind meant to imply authority. Ruth recognized it at once and felt the same tightening in her chest she had felt the first time, only sharper now, edged with certainty. Institutions used thicker paper when they wanted compliance to feel inevitable. Lydia took the envelope from her mother and weighed it in her hand. They have already decided, she said. Decided what? Ruth asked. Lydia broke the seal carefully as if the paper itself might be evidence one day. That I must be explained. The meeting was scheduled for a private office inside the university proper, beyond the halls where Lydia had first been displayed. This building smelled different, polished wood, leather bindings, old ink. Power lived here quietly. It did not announce itself. Dr. Harold Whitcomb waited behind a broad desk, fingers steepled, eyes alert. Edwin Markham stood near the window, arms folded, his irritation barely concealed. Two other men were present, introduced only by surname and title, their roles deliberately vague. Observers. Advisors. Witnesses. Dr. Louise Carter arrived last. She paused in the doorway when she saw Lydia, something tightening behind her eyes. Carter had spent her career learning when to speak and when silence was safer. She had also learned that silence came with its own costs. Whitcomb gestured toward a chair. Miss Johnson, thank you for coming. I did not thank you, Lydia replied. Markham scoffed. Whitcomb ignored him. We wish to understand the limits of your abilities, Whitcomb said. Properly. Systematically. You wish to preserve your conclusions, Lydia said, and test whether I threaten them. The room stilled. That is an accusation, Markham snapped. It is an observation, Lydia replied. Whitcomb leaned back. You are remarkably confident. I am accurate, Lydia said. Carter watched carefully. Lydia did not posture. She did not seek approval. That alone unsettled them. Intelligence could be dismissed. Certainty could not. They began again, this time with layered problems meant to expose inconsistency. Time sequences. Interrupted questions. Variables changed mid-sentence. Lydia adjusted without visible effort. Markham's jaw tightened with each correct response. "This proves nothing," he said finally. "You may possess an unusual memory." Whitcomb nodded. "Savant tendencies, perhaps." Carter spoke before she could stop herself. "That does not account for predictive consistency." Both men turned sharply toward her. "Prediction is interpretation," Whitcomb said coldly. "Not evidence." "It becomes evidence when it repeats," Carter replied. Markham's voice rose. "You are romanticizing an anomaly." "I am observing one," Carter said. Lydia listened to them argue as if they were discussing weather patterns. She had already traced the paths of their thoughts, knew which direction each would take and where they would refuse to go. "You are afraid," Lydia said quietly. Whitcomb's smile was thin. "Afraid of what?" "That your measurements are incomplete," Lydia said. "That what you call intelligence is only what you can quantify." Markham laughed harshly. "And what would you call it?" Lydia met his gaze. "Recognition." The word landed badly. Whitcomb stood. "This session is concluded." Carter rose as well. "You cannot simply—" "I can," Whitcomb said. "And I will." Outside the office, Carter caught up to Lydia and Ruth in the corridor. "You should be careful," Carter said softly. "They are not searching for truth." "I know," Lydia replied. Carter hesitated. "If they publish—" "They will," Lydia said. Incorrectly. Ruth felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What happens then?" she asked. Lydia thought for a moment. Truly thought. "Then they will try to make me small," she said. "And when that fails, they will try to make me disappear." Carter swallowed. "I can help." Lydia looked at her. "You will try." That night, Whitcomb drafted a memorandum outlining concerns about methodological contamination. Markham supplied language about racial suggestibility and performance mimicry. Together, they built a framework sturdy enough to withstand scrutiny and vague enough to exclude contradiction. Carter requested to review the draft. Whitcomb denied her access. "You are too close to the subject," he said. "What you mean," Carter replied, "is that I am not afraid of it." Whitcomb did not answer. By the end of the week, copies circulated privately. No official publication yet. Just enough to shape opinion. To plant doubt before certainty could take root. Lydia read the memorandum without seeing it, the way one might hear a melody before it was played. She corrected sentences in her head. Identified the paragraph that would later be quoted out of context. She also noted something else. One name was missing. Carter's. They were isolating her. What Whitcomb did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that isolation worked both ways. They changed the conditions first. No public rooms. No windows. No witnesses whose loyalty could not be assumed. Lydia was brought through a side entrance this time, past corridors that smelled of damp stone and old ink, into a narrow chamber lit by a single gas lamp that hissed softly as if impatient with the air. Ruth was not allowed inside. "It is standard procedure," Whitcomb said, not meeting her eyes. Lydia squeezed her mother's hand once before letting go. The pressure was reassuring, deliberate. "I will remember everything," she said. Ruth watched the door close and felt something inside her chest lock into place. Inside the chamber, the desk was bare. No chalk. No slate. No paper. The walls were closer than before, the ceiling lower. This was intentional. Spaces shaped behavior. Whitcomb believed that. Markham sat opposite Lydia, his notes stacked neatly, his pen aligned with the table's edge. Two other men stood near the wall, silent, their faces already set in the expressions of men prepared to deny what they were about to see. "You will answer verbally," Markham said. "No corrections after the fact." "I do not correct after," Lydia replied. "Only before." Markham ignored her. The questions came in clusters now, layered deliberately to confuse. He would begin one sequence, interrupt it midway, insert another, then return to the first with altered parameters. It was a method designed to fracture attention. Lydia followed easily. She answered without pause, without visible effort. Her eyes did not dart. Her breathing did not change. The men by the wall exchanged glances that grew tighter with each response. Whitcomb watched closely. He had abandoned the search for trickery. There was none. No tapping. No counting under breath. No tell he could expose. "Time intervals," Markham said abruptly. "Predict the next sequence." Lydia listened. She answered. "That is conjecture," one of the observers muttered. "Then test it," Lydia said. They did. She was correct. Again. Markham's pen snapped. Whitcomb intervened, his voice clipped. "Blindfold her." This time there was no objection. No mother present to protest. The cloth was tied firmly, pressing against Lydia's eyes, blocking all light. The room grew smaller still. The questions continued. She answered them all. "What do you see?" Whitcomb asked suddenly. Lydia paused. "Shapes," she said. "Pressure. Movement. That is meaningless." "It is inconvenient," Lydia replied. Markham slammed his palm against the desk. "This is absurd. You expect us to accept descriptions without method. You accept measurements without understanding," Lydia said calmly. "This is no different." Silence settled thickly. Whitcomb removed the blindfold himself. When Lydia blinked, her eyes met his without hesitation. There was no triumph there. No defiance. Only something like patience. "You are wasting our time," Markham said. "This proves nothing conclusive." "It proves you are afraid to conclude," Lydia replied. Whitcomb stood. "That will be all for today." As Lydia rose, she felt it again, that shift. The moment when curiosity curdled. When observation became containment. Outside, Ruth waited, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "They did not let me stay," she said. "They did not want witnesses," Lydia replied. That evening, Carter read the preliminary notes Whitcomb had allowed her to see. The omissions were obvious. Correct answers framed as coincidence. Predictions labeled interpretation. Entire sequences reduced to vague language. She confronted Whitcomb in his office. "This is dishonest," she said. "This is cautious," he replied. "You are editing reality. We are contextualizing it. You are protecting a theory." Whitcomb's eyes hardened. "I am protecting an institution." Carter leaned forward. "If she is what she appears to be." "She is not," Whitcomb snapped. "She cannot be." Carter understood then that evidence no longer mattered. Meanwhile, Markham drafted a separate report suggesting rehearsal, unconscious cueing, and exaggerated claims fueled by racial novelty. He sent copies to 3 colleagues before Whitcomb could stop him. The machine had begun to move. Lydia felt it lying awake that night. The air seemed heavier, as if filled with things unsaid. Numbers shifted around her, arranging themselves into outcomes she did not want but could not avoid. "They will escalate," she said softly into the dark. Ruth stirred. "Who will?" "The men who need me to be wrong," Lydia replied. "What do we do?" Lydia thought of the blindfold. Of the room with no windows. "We prepare," she said. What Whitcomb did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Lydia Johnson had already mapped the end of their inquiry. They were still asking questions. She was already counting consequences. If Lydia had possessed the language the men used, she might have called it a method. But methods implied steps, and what she experienced did not move in steps. It arrived whole. Numbers did not line up in her mind the way they did on paper. They pressed. They leaned. They occupied space the way furniture did in a room you knew well enough to walk through in the dark. When a question was asked, the shape of the answer was already there, waiting to be recognized rather than built. She did not calculate. She recalled. Not memory in the way Ruth remembered hymns or recipes, but something deeper, older. Patterns repeated themselves across different surfaces. A sequence behaved the same way a crowd did. A probability curve bent like a river after rain. When Markham spoke, Lydia heard not only his words but the hesitation behind them, the places where certainty thinned. That was how she knew which answers frightened them. On the evening after the blindfold test, Lydia sat at the small table in their kitchen, her fingers resting lightly against the wood. Ruth watched her from the stove, uneasy in a way she could not quite name. "You should stop correcting them," Ruth said carefully. "Men do not like it." "I am not correcting them," Lydia replied. "I am noticing." "That is worse," Ruth said. Lydia smiled faintly. She loved her mother for that honesty. Later, alone in her room, Lydia spread nothing out in front of her. No papers. No figures. She closed her eyes and let the pressure come. Outcomes layered over one another like panes of glass. Some were clear. Some resisted. She saw Whitcomb at his desk late at night, crossing out phrases that came too close to truth. She saw Markham sending letters he would later deny. She saw Carter standing in a corridor, deciding whether to speak or remain silent. What Lydia could not see clearly was herself beyond a certain point. The further she looked, the more the shapes blurred. Disappearance had a texture, thin, quiet, deliberate. Down the street, in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and ink, Carter reread her own notes by lamplight. She had begun keeping a separate ledger, one not shared with Whitcomb. In it were exact phrasing, exact timings, exact answers. She wrote with care, aware that the act itself might one day be questioned. "This is not savant behavior," she murmured. She had seen savants before. Brilliant, yes, but narrow. Lydia was not narrow. Lydia generalized, anticipated, adjusted. Carter closed the ledger and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. She did not yet know why she felt the need to hide it. She only knew that trust had become conditional. The next test removed even the pretense of fairness. They did not tell Lydia what would be asked. They did not tell her how long it would last. They altered questions mid-sentence and laughed quietly when she frowned, mistaking attention for confusion. "Predict this," Markham said, scribbling numbers he did not show her. Lydia listened to the scratch of the pen, the rhythm of his breathing. "You will stop writing in 3 seconds," she said. "Your hand will cramp." Markham froze. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The observer shifted, suddenly alert. "That proves nothing," Whitcomb said quickly. "It proves he is tired," Lydia replied. The room exhaled uneasily. Whitcomb ended the session early. Again. Outside, Ruth waited as always. She searched Lydia's face for signs of strain and found none, which frightened her more than exhaustion would have. "They are trying to break you," Ruth said. "They are trying to reduce me," Lydia replied. Ruth's voice shook. "To what?" Lydia considered. "To something they already understand." That night, a stone shattered the window of their front room. No note. No message. Just the sound of breaking glass and footsteps running away. Ruth swept the shards with trembling hands. Lydia watched the pieces catch lamplight, each fragment reflecting a slightly different image of the same room. "They are moving faster now," Lydia said. Ruth looked at her sharply. "Who?" "The questions," Lydia said. "They are becoming actions." By morning, Whitcomb had received a letter from a colleague in New York, warning him that rumors were spreading beyond Philadelphia. Another from Boston requesting clarification. Interest was growing where he had intended containment. He crumpled both letters and threw them into the fire. "We will settle this publicly," Markham said when they met later that day. "One final demonstration. End it cleanly." Whitcomb hesitated. He did not like unpredictability. He liked control. "A lecture hall," Markham continued. "Witnesses. Authority." Carter, seated quietly at the edge of the room, felt her stomach drop. "That is a mistake," she said. Markham turned to her sharply. "Afraid of transparency?" "Afraid of consequences," Carter replied. Whitcomb stared into the fire, watching paper curl and blacken. "Schedule it," he said finally, "and make certain we control the question." What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Lydia had already heard the question they planned to ask. She had also heard the silence that would follow her answer. The announcement was made quietly, which in Whitcomb's world meant deliberately. No posters. No handbills. Invitations delivered by hand to men whose opinions already mattered and whose loyalty could be counted on. A public demonstration, yes, but curated. Witnesses chosen not to observe, but to confirm. The lecture hall selected was larger than before, with tiered seating and a raised platform that placed the subject below the audience's line of sight. Architecture was a language Whitcomb understood well. Lydia learned of it from a notice slipped into Ruth's hand at the washhouse. "They want you again," Ruth said that evening, her voice low. "In front of people." Lydia nodded. She had known since Markham first suggested it. "They believe fear will look like authority," Lydia said. Ruth sat heavily at the table. "And what will it look like to you?" Lydia did not answer immediately. She traced a line in the grain of the wood with her finger, following it to its end. "It will look like the moment before they decide," she said. In Whitcomb's office, fear had replaced curiosity entirely. Markham paced, restless, his confidence fraying at the edges. "We must narrow the scope," he insisted. "One question. One decisive problem. No improvisation." Whitcomb nodded. "No opportunities for interpretation." Carter sat across from them, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had not been invited to speak, but she had been invited to witness. That, she realized, was worse. "You are not testing her anymore," she said finally. "You are staging an outcome." Markham turned on her. "We are preserving credibility." "By falsifying uncertainty?" Whitcomb's voice cut through the room. "Enough. This is not a philosophical exercise." Carter met his gaze. It became one the moment she answered what you could not. Whitcomb's jaw tightened. "You are dangerously close to insubordination." Carter did not look away. "And you are dangerously close to fear." Silence followed. Heavy. Charged. Whitcomb broke it by turning to his desk. You will attend the demonstration, he said coolly. You will observe. You will not intervene. Carter understood then that her role had been decided for her. Legitimacy without agency. Presence without power. That night, Lydia dreamed of a hall filled with men whose faces blurred together, their mouths opening and closing without sound. She stood alone at the center, light above her too bright, shadows too sharp. When she spoke, the room did not hear words, only disruption. She woke before dawn, her heart steady. At breakfast, Ruth tried to sound normal. You will wear your blue dress, she said. The clean one. Lydia nodded. They will not see the dress. Ruth forced a smile. They will see a child. They will see a problem, Lydia replied gently. The day of the demonstration arrived with cold clarity. October air cut sharp and clean, the sky a hard, unforgiving blue. Carriages lined the street outside the hall. Men in dark coats stepped down, their voices low, confident, already rehearsing conclusions. Inside, Carter took her seat near the aisle. She scanned the room and felt her unease deepen. Too many familiar faces. Too many men who had built careers on certainty. Whitcomb stood at the podium, his presence commanding without warmth. Gentlemen, he began, we are gathered to examine claims that have circulated without sufficient rigor. Lydia waited below, hands folded, her posture composed. She felt the room before she saw it, the density of expectation, the tension pulled tight. Markham stood beside Whitcomb, a folded paper in his hand. Carter recognized it immediately. A single problem. Carefully selected. Whitcomb continued. This demonstration will conclude our inquiry. The phrasing was deliberate. Finality framed as fairness. Lydia looked up at the men above her. She met Markham's eyes and saw the thing he was trying hardest to hide. Not doubt. Panic. What if you are wrong? Carter wanted to ask. What if the world shifts and does not settle back into place? But she said nothing. The room was not built for questions like that. Markham cleared his throat. Miss Johnson, he said, his voice carrying, you will be presented with one final problem. You will answer immediately without elaboration. Lydia inclined her head. You already know the answer, she said. A murmur rippled through the hall. Markham's face flushed. Proceed, Whitcomb said sharply. As Markham unfolded the paper, Lydia felt the pressure shift. This was it. The convergence she had seen nights ago, the narrowing of paths. She also felt something else. A fracture. Not in herself but in the room. In the certainty they had carried in with them. What Whitcomb did not yet understand, what Markham refused to accept, was that fear, once introduced, did not retreat quietly. It demanded witnesses, and it would have them soon enough. The problem Markham read aloud had been designed to sound simple. That was its cruelty. It involved a sequence buried inside a sequence, probabilities nested within probabilities, the kind of question that invited confidence before dismantling it. A question meant to expose hesitation, to reveal guessing, to fail her in a way that could be explained afterward. Markham's voice was steady as he spoke, but his fingers trembled slightly as he held the paper. Lydia noticed. She always noticed. When he finished, the hall waited. Lydia did not answer immediately. The pause stretched longer than any before it. Men shifted in their seats. Whitcomb leaned forward, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. This was what they had prepared for. Silence could be shaped. Failure could be framed. Then Lydia spoke. She gave the answer. Clearly. Without emphasis. A few men nodded reflexively, already half convinced they had won. Then Lydia continued. You will reject that answer, she said, her voice calm, carrying easily through the hall. Not because it is incorrect, but because it produces an outcome you do not want. Whitcomb rose sharply. That is enough. You will say the problem was improperly constrained, Lydia went on. You will claim I inferred cues. You will publish a summary within 2 weeks, omitting the correction in the fourth assumption. Markham's breath caught. You will not mention, Lydia said, that the correct outcome predicts a structural failure in your prior work. Page 47. The second proof. The hall erupted into murmurs. Whitcomb slammed his hand against the podium. Remove her. No, Carter said suddenly, standing. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp with something like desperation. Let her finish. Whitcomb turned on her. Sit down. Lydia looked directly at Markham. You already know this, she said. You realized it last night. That is why you did not sleep. Markham's face drained of color. Security, Whitcomb barked. Two men moved toward the platform, but they hesitated. Something in Lydia's stillness unsettled them. She did not look like a child cornered. She looked like someone watching a process complete itself. "You will call this misconduct," Lydia said. "You will say I disrupted scholarly procedure. But the damage will already be done." Whitcomb pointed at her. "This demonstration is concluded." Lydia nodded once. "Yes." They escorted her out amid confusion and half-formed arguments. Outside, the October air felt suddenly thin. Ruth took Lydia's arm, her grip tight. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I answered," Lydia said. Inside the hall, Whitcomb closed the doors and addressed the remaining men. "What you witnessed," he said carefully, "was manipulation." Markham sat rigid, staring at his hands. Whitcomb continued, "We will issue a statement. Unified. Controlled. Any deviation will be interpreted as endorsement of charlatanism." A man near the back raised a tentative hand. "She mentioned a proof." "Which is irrelevant," Whitcomb snapped, "because it has not been verified." Carter stood alone near the aisle, her heart pounding. "It has," she said quietly. Every head turned. "I checked it," Carter went on. "Months ago. I assumed the error was mine." Whitcomb stared at her. "You are speculating." "No," Carter said. "I am confessing." The room froze. Whitcomb recovered quickly. "You will submit your notes for review." "I will not." Whitcomb smiled thinly. "Then you will no longer be associated with this inquiry." Carter felt the weight of that sentence settle into her bones. Years of work. Credibility. All balanced on compliance. "I understand," she said. That night, Whitcomb drafted the official report. He softened language, removed predictions, reframed certainty as coincidence. He used phrases like methodological contamination and observer expectation. Markham signed it without reading the final version. By morning, copies were already circulating. Carter packed her office in silence. She removed her ledger from beneath the floorboard and wrapped it in cloth. She did not know yet what she would do with it, only that she would not surrender it. Across the city, Lydia sat by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the street. "They will try to erase today," Ruth said. "They cannot," Lydia replied. "Too many saw." "They can lie," Ruth said. "Yes," Lydia agreed. "But lies fracture differently." Within a week, the narrative was set. Lydia Johnson was described as clever but coached, impressive but unreliable, a curiosity inflated by sensation and undermined by decorum. The final report concluded that no extraordinary conclusions could be drawn. The public accepted it easily. Institutions always spoke with authority. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Markham stopped publishing. Whitcomb avoided certain conferences. Invitations went unanswered. Questions lingered where certainty had once lived. And Lydia Johnson disappeared from official records soon after. No enrollment. No census update. No obituary. Only absence. What the report did not mention, what it could not contain, was the way the room had felt when Lydia spoke. Fear had entered the ledger. And it would not be balanced. The erasure did not happen all at once. That would have drawn attention. It arrived instead in small, reasonable omissions that no one thought to question until there was nothing left to find. The first was the school ledger. Lydia's name simply failed to appear the following term. No transfer recorded. No dismissal noted. The clerk assumed an error and moved on. Then the church registry. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, all carefully kept. Lydia's entry remained, but her name was never spoken aloud again. When Ruth asked why, the deacon smiled tightly and said it was better not to invite trouble. "What trouble?" Ruth asked. The deacon did not answer. By winter, the street off Lombard grew quieter around their house. Neighbors still nodded, still exchanged pleasantries, but they no longer lingered. Children were called inside when Lydia passed. A woman crossed herself and whispered a prayer meant to ward something off. "They are afraid of you," Ruth said one night, her voice brittle. "They are afraid of what happened near me," Lydia replied. Ruth did not sleep much after that. The letters began soon after. Not invitations this time. Warnings disguised as concern. One arrived and signed, advising that Lydia's exhibition had stirred unnecessary attention. Another suggested relocation, phrased as opportunity. A third hinted, only hinted, at consequences should the family persist in refusing discretion. Ruth burned them all. Carter read about Lydia's absence weeks later in a footnote of a journal she no longer officially received. The wording was careful, The subject is no longer available for further observation. No longer available. As if Lydia had been an instrument misplaced. Carter folded the journal slowly. She thought of the ledger beneath her floorboard, of the way Whitcomb's eyes had hardened when she refused to submit it. She went to 7th Ward that afternoon. The Johnson house was shuttered. Curtains drawn. The window that had been broken weeks earlier remained repaired but scarred, the glass slightly warped, distorting reflections. Carter knocked. No answer. A neighbor watched from across the street, her expression tight. "They left," the woman said finally. "When?" Carter asked. The woman shrugged. "Nighttime. Quiet." "Where did they go?" Another shrug. "People say different things." That was when Carter understood. There would be no single story. No trail to follow. Disappearance worked best when it fractured. Some said Ruth took Lydia south to live with relatives who did not exist. Others whispered that Lydia had been sent away to a private institution, one that did not keep public records. A few claimed the girl had fallen ill and died quietly, spared public notice out of mercy. Whitcomb encouraged none of these stories. He did not need to. Markham avoided the subject entirely. When asked, he waved it away as a distraction. His colleagues noticed his hands shook now when he lectured, that his proofs grew conservative, cautious, as if he were afraid to look too far ahead. Whitcomb, meanwhile, found himself invited to fewer conferences. Not shunned. Just overlooked. Younger men asked sharper questions. Older men grew vague. He dismissed it as coincidence. But at night, when the house was quiet, he found himself replaying Lydia's voice. "You already knew this." Carter waited months before opening the ledger again. She did it by lamplight, carefully, as if the pages might bruise. The notes were as precise as she remembered. Dates. Timings. Verbatim phrasing. Too precise to dismiss. She copied them twice. One set she mailed anonymously to a colleague in Chicago who specialized in theoretical anomalies. The other she hid where she knew Whitcomb would never look. Inside a library catalog drawer. Years passed. By 1905, Lydia Johnson's name surfaced only in rumors. In arguments between students late at night. In a single unpublished manuscript rejected for lacking verifiable sources. In a footnote crossed out by an editor's pen. What had happened to her depended on who was asked. What she became was harder to answer. Because sometimes in lectures across the country a proof would stall. A sequence would resist resolution. And a student, often black, often dismissed, would suggest an adjustment that felt uncomfortably familiar. Whitcomb dismissed such moments as coincidence. Carter did not. She began to suspect that Lydia had not vanished. She had dispersed. Ruth Johnson was never seen again in Philadelphia. No death record. No burial. Only absence layered over absence. And yet, in a small town outside Baltimore years later, a woman remembered a quiet girl who taught her son to count without numbers. In Chicago, a dock worker spoke of a woman who predicted accidents before they happened. None of the stories used the same name. That was the point. What Whitcomb and the others had not understood, what they had been too afraid to consider, was that containment only worked on things that stayed still. Lydia Johnson had never done that. And history, for all its ledgers and proofs, had never been very good at recording what moved in silence. By the time the decade turned, the men who had once spoken Lydia Johnson's name with certainty no longer spoke it at all. That silence was not peace. It was avoidance. Edwin Markham's lectures grew shorter. He avoided advanced demonstrations, preferring well-worn proofs that had already been accepted and safely cited. Students noticed how he paused now before conclusions, how his chalk hesitated at the board as if waiting for permission to finish a thought. When challenged, he bristled, accusing others of imprecision. But in private, the truth pressed in. He woke some nights convinced he had miscounted something fundamental. Not a number, but a premise. His published work was still praised, still referenced, but something inside him had fractured during that October afternoon. He began to drink more heavily. His handwriting deteriorated. By 1903, he stopped submitting papers altogether. When a former student asked him once, quietly, why he had abandoned probability theory, Markham's voice sharpened. "Because it lies," he said. He did not explain further. Harold Whitcomb fared better on the surface. He retained his position, his title, his office lined with books that claimed authority over the natural order. Yet invitations dwindled. Committees that once sought his opinion began consulting younger men instead. When Whitcomb spoke, he sensed, perhaps imagined, a delay before assent, as though listeners were checking their trust before granting it. He blamed changing times. Privately, he reviewed his old charts and measurements with new irritation. They no longer reassured him. Instead, they felt incomplete, like maps missing a crucial landmark. He never spoke Lydia's name again. Louise Carter left academia entirely in 1901. Her resignation letter was brief and careful, citing philosophical differences and fatigue. No accusations. No appeals. She packed her books, removed the ledger from its hiding place, and relocated to Chicago under the guise of family obligation. There, she found work quietly, editing manuscripts, advising from the margins, contributing anonymously to journals that valued ideas over pedigree. She never published the ledger in full. She understood too well what would happen if she did. Instead, she let pieces surface gradually, embedded in other arguments disguised as hypotheticals. A margin note here. A correction there. Enough to unsettle without exposing the source. Occasionally, she heard rumors. A woman in Baltimore whose predictions saved 3 men from a dock collapse. A teacher in Ohio dismissed 4 unorthodox methods after students began solving problems years beyond their level. A midwife who always arrived moments before complications began. Carter learned to listen for patterns rather than names. As for Ruth Johnson, the trail ended completely. No employment records. No church transfers. No census entries. Those who had known her remembered a woman who kept her eyes lowered and her voice steady. A woman who believed in survival through restraint. But if anyone asked what Ruth had done after Philadelphia, the answers contradicted each other too neatly to be accidental. Some said she had grown bolder. Others said she had grown invisible. Both could be true. Years later, Carter would dream of Ruth standing in a doorway, watching her daughter walk away into a crowd that never noticed how it parted to let her through. History did what it always did best. It simplified. By the 1910s, the brief mention of Lydia Johnson that still lingered in obscure indexes had been misfiled under curiosities. A footnote of a footnote. A rumor mistaken for error. Scholars who encountered the name assumed exaggeration, then dismissed it entirely. The record, they said, was incomplete. What they meant was inconvenient. Markham died quietly in 1912, his final years marked by isolation and declining health. Whitcomb lived longer, stubborn and convinced that time itself would vindicate him. He died with his shelves intact and his doubts unresolved. Carter outlived them both. In 1934, she attended a small lecture given by a young mathematician whose approach felt unsettlingly familiar. When he corrected a proof on the board without hesitation, Carter felt the old pressure return, faint but unmistakable. Afterward, she approached him. "Where did you learn to see numbers like that?" she asked. The man hesitated. "From someone who taught my mother," he said. "A long time ago." Carter nodded. That was enough. Because truth did not require acknowledgement to persist. It only required passage. And Lydia Johnson, whatever she had been labeled, whatever had been erased, had passed through systems that were never designed to hold her. The men who tried to contain her mistook disappearance for defeat. They mistook silence for absence. They would never understand that some minds did not belong to institutions, did not submit to measurement, and did not remain where they were first observed. They moved, quietly, and they changed the shape of what followed. By the time the century reached its second decade, the world had changed its clothes but not its habits. New machines hummed in factories. New theories crowded lecture halls. Men spoke more carefully now, wrapping certainty in longer sentences, but the impulse beneath remained the same. Order must be preserved. Anomalies must be explained or erased. Lydia Johnson's name did not return to print, but her influence did. It appeared first as irritation. In 1918, a statistical model proposed at a Midwestern university collapsed under scrutiny when a graduate student identified a structural flaw no one else had noticed. The correction was dismissed as intuition, then quietly adopted without credit. In 1922, an engineer revised a bridge load calculation moments before construction began, averting a failure that would have killed dozens. When asked how he knew, he shrugged. "It felt wrong," he said. By the late 1920s, Carter had learned to recognize the signature. Not brilliance alone. Not memory. Not even prediction. Recognition. The ability to see outcomes before others believed outcomes could be seen. She encountered it most often among those who were least believed. Black students. Women. Laborers whose insights were credited to luck. Their contributions absorbed, anonymized, stripped of origin. Carter never corrected the record publicly. She had learned that lesson in Philadelphia. Instead, she collected stories. She kept them in a small notebook now, thinner than the ledger, easier to hide. Dates, locations, descriptions. Always the same pattern. Someone taught quietly. Someone noticed too much. Someone moved on before attention hardened into danger. In 1931, she heard a name whispered in a Chicago boarding house. Not Lydia. A different name. A common one. But the description matched. A woman in her 40s. Calm. Precise. Unmarried. Known for helping children see things early. She never stayed long in one place. Paid her rent on time. Left no forwarding address. Carter did not seek her out. Some truths protected themselves by distance. Meanwhile, institutions continued their careful forgetting. In 1935, a historian compiling a retrospective on turn-of-the-century scientific controversies stumbled across Whitcomb's final report. He noted its vagueness, its lack of data, its defensive tone. He considered investigating further. He did not. The archive offered no incentive, no funding, no career advantage. The past had already been settled, and unsettling it served no one in power. That was how erasure endured, not through malice alone but through convenience. Carter understood that too well. She died in 1941, quietly, her possessions dispersed according to instructions that seemed unremarkable to those executing them. Books donated. Papers burned. The small notebook missing entirely. No one noticed. Decades passed. By the 1960s, the language had shifted again. Intelligence was discussed with new caution, new terminology. Bias was acknowledged in theory if not always in practice. Scholars spoke of hidden contributors and lost voices, gesturing vaguely toward injustice without naming it. Still, Lydia Johnson remained absent. Until a graduate student in the 1980s found something odd. A reference that led nowhere. A citation without a source. A correction attributed to no one. The student followed it backward, then sideways, then into dead ends. The trail dissolved repeatedly as if designed to do so. Frustrated, he abandoned the search. But the question lingered. What kind of mind left traces without leaving a name? The answer, if it existed, could not be footnoted. Because Lydia Johnson had never been interested in recognition. She had been interested in outcomes. And outcomes, unlike reputations, did not require permission. What Whitcomb and Markham had failed to understand, what institutions still struggled to accept, was that containment only worked when the thing being contained agreed to remain singular. Lydia had not. She had become a method without attribution, a correction without signature, a pattern that resurfaced wherever measurement failed. History would later congratulate itself for expanding its definitions, for acknowledging genius in unexpected places. But the truth was quieter. The truth was that Lydia Johnson had forced that expansion simply by existing, briefly, impossibly, in a room that could not hold her. And then by leaving it, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in motion, the kind that cannot be archived, the kind that changes what follows without ever asking to be remembered. In the end, Lydia Johnson was never disproven. She was only avoided. No document ever demonstrated fraud. No test ever revealed error. What survived instead was hesitation, academic, institutional, deliberate. The kind that settled over questions too dangerous to pursue and slowly hardened into policy. By the time the 20th century learned new language for intelligence, Lydia's case had already been categorized into something safer. Anomaly, rumor, exaggeration. The absence of records was treated as proof of insignificance rather than evidence of suppression. That was how history protected itself. Yet even erased stories leave pressure behind. In moments when systems failed, when equations broke down, when predictions resisted calculation, when certainty cracked, people felt it. A sense that something essential was missing from the model. A reminder that intelligence had never belonged solely to classrooms or journals. It belonged to recognition. The ability to see what others refused to look at. Lydia Johnson had possessed that ability in a way that terrified men whose power depended on fixed boundaries. She did not overthrow institutions. She did not challenge them publicly for long. She did something far more unsettling. She moved beyond them. What became of her after Philadelphia was never written down in one place. And that was not an accident. Because to survive, she had learned what Ruth Johnson always understood instinctively. Attention was a form of danger. Visibility invited correction. Correction invited punishment. So Lydia became diffuse. She passed knowledge without claiming it. Corrected without attaching her name. Taught without leaving a trail that could be followed backward. That was her real defiance. Not the lecture hall. Not the impossible answer. But the refusal to be pinned in place long enough to be destroyed. When historians ask today why certain breakthroughs appeared prematurely, or why some corrections emerged without precedent. They search archives for missing links. They assume loss, accident, poor record keeping. They do not consider intent. They do not ask whether someone chose not to be found, because acknowledging that possibility would require admitting that intelligence has always existed beyond permission, beyond validation, beyond the boundaries of who is allowed to be brilliant. Lydia Johnson was never meant to fit inside the world that discovered her. She exposed it instead, and then she left it to adjust on its own. Whether she lived a long life or a quiet one, whether she taught hundreds or only a few, whether her name was ever spoken again in full certainty, no one can say for sure. That uncertainty is the point, because the measure of her impact was never fame. It was consequence. And consequence does not announce itself. It accumulates. It moves forward, just like she did. So now I ask you, what do you think Lydia Johnson truly was? A once-in-a-generation mathematical genius whose mind outpaced her era? Or something even more unsettling? Proof that intelligence has always existed where power refused to look? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. And if you want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories that blur the line between documented history and buried truth, subscribe to the Slave Rebellion, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes history still has secrets worth uncovering. These stories were buried for a reason. These voices were erased on purpose. We remember them here. See you in the next story.